Hi everybody, we are about to start our session on the intermittent operated slow sand filter. This is a presentation that's going to be given to us by two persons from Samaritan first. I am going to try to change my slide. Here we go. So I'll start with myself, I guess. I'm Emily Samaritan. I'm an international technical advisor at CAWST. And today we are very happy to welcome Ray and Ron from Samaritan Spurs who have experience with the intermittent operated slow sand filter. Before we start, I just have a little bit of logistic to go through. So with the program we are using, and because we are already at 50 participants, which is amazing, by the way, we will keep everybody muted. Only the presenters are going to be unmuted, and this is just to avoid interruption and noises. However, if you have any questions, you are welcome to ask them at any point in the chat box that's located at the bottom of your window. So you should be able to see the chat and ask any questions or comments there. And what we will do is at the end of the presentation, I will be asking the questions on your behalf. Also, the presentation is recorded and you will each receive an email with the link to the recording. So do not worry about remembering things or taking notes. We will share that with you. So I would like now to welcome Ray and Ron. I'm going to unmute them so that they can welcome you as well. Here we go. And just to say hi, we're each going to share our webcams quickly to welcome you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome from a nondescript white room in Toronto. This is Ray Cantwell.
Hello, everyone. This is Ron from Calgary. I'm in our library.
And I'm also in Calgary. So we're going to cut our webcam so that you can enjoy the presentation, and I'm going to make Ray presenter. There we go. Perfect. So from now on, Ray, you can share your screen, and I'm going to mute myself for everybody to enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much, Emily, and welcome everyone. Ron and I will be tag teaming this presentation, so I'll start by handing it over to him.
Sure. Well, again, it's good to be here with everyone today. I see a lot of familiar names from all over, and I'm looking forward to our time together through this webinar. We do have two primary learning objectives. We'd like you to learn about the design, performance, and operation of the iSSF, the intermittently operated slow sand filter. We'd also like to introduce and strongly recommend the manual that we co-developed with CAWST. It's a great starting point if you're planning to implement this technology yourself. We wanted to quickly take you through an overview of the presentation. You'll just note the sections that we'll be going through. A quick overview of the technology, a little bit about our history. We'll ask the question, is this suitable for you? We'll take you through some design features, performance study that was conducted, section on operation, maintenance, and troubleshooting, hardware or filter costs, community engagement and monitoring, and a quick introduction to the manual itself. Having said that, I want to pass on the next section to Ray.
Right. Thank you very much, Ron. As we mentioned, Ron and I will be passing it back and forth. I've got one slide to share with you here, which is really an overview of our intermittently operated slow sand filter system. I want to make sure that everyone has a context for what we're talking about, and then we'll go into more detail in the coming slides. So you should be able to see my cursor here. What I'd like to say is that this system is shares a lot of things in common with household biosand filter and also with the traditional large-scale slow sand filter. And it approaches behaving more like a slow sand filter than even the household biosand filter does. So to give you the overview, and we're going to follow the theoretical path of a drop of water for this system. So if you follow my cursor here, well, we would have some water that's source water, untreated, that enters what we call our reservoir tank, or our source water reservoir, and that can be pumped in by hand, by motorized pump. It can even be loaded in by bucket if you really wanted. So the water enters here, and then it travels through a PVC pipe here to the filter tank, which is in the middle here. The filter tank has a lot of the same features that household biosand filter has. There's filtration sand, so our theoretical drop of water travels down through the filter sand, through layers of gravel, including coarse sand and gravel at the bottom. From there, it's collected into a PVC perforated pipe at the bottom, which is also part of the under drain, and then up through a riser pipe. So those of you who are familiar with the household biosand filter will know that most of those have their riser pipe on the inside. With this system, it's on the outside. And then water travels all the way through here into the storage tank, where it can be accessed when needed by opening any one of the taps in the system here. And you can put taps wherever you want. One of the benefits of this system is it has an integrated storage tank, so you don't have the risk of contamination, or the increased risk of contamination from collecting in a bucket or jerry can under with all the air gaps and opportunity for contamination. A few other things I'll call your attention to. Going back to the left, there's an isolation valve right here with a red handle that can be closed to clean the source water tank, and which can get dirty if you've got a dirty source water. There's a float valve here. This float valve controls the water level above the sand, and we'll talk about that later. This green line is our diffuser, or I shouldn't say diffuser, splash plate, which prevents the water from hitting the sand with great force and disrupting it right at the inlet. There's a wash valve, or a wash water drain valve, that can be used to clean the filter, and we'll talk about that. And then the last thing is that there's a vent, and also in theory an overflow here to prevent and reduce the risk of siphoning. So this is the overall system, and we'll talk about all of it in more detail.
Thanks, Ray. Let me take you through a brief overview of our history. Samaritan's First is entering our 8th year in implementing the iSSF. Other names we gave it in the past were the school BSF or institutional BSF. We have a long history with a biosand water filter and with Dr. Mans, and we began implementing biosand filters since 1997. Our first iSSF design was a 2-tank design in 2011, which was developed in Cambodia. In Ray's overview, he described the prototypical 3-tank design. The first filters did not have a reservoir tank and was limited to small batch processing throughout the day, around 120 liters at a time. In 2012, the filter was redesigned into the current 3-tank design, which allows for ongoing gravity feed, constant gravity head, and a constant flow rate. And Ray will speak more on this later. Since 2012 to 2017, there's over 300 of these filters in Cambodia, primarily in schools, of which Samaritan's First has funded approximately 250. We took the filters beyond Cambodia in 2013, and we installed our first filter in Nicaragua. And since then, we've exported it to other countries, as you can see, to El Salvador, Nicaragua, Philippines, Kenya, Niger, DRC, and Nepal. The filter itself is only one part of a full school wash package that we offer at Samaritan's First. And I also wanted to note that in 2016, we began discussing with CAWST on the development of a manual so we could readily share this design to other implementers. And so in 2017, we were able to release that manual with CAWST. I wanted to take us through this section on suitability. And the main question that we're asking here is the iSSF suitable for your school or project? We think there are some basic considerations. Number one is effectiveness. How well does a technology perform? Is log 2 sufficient for you? Does it need to be coupled with anything else, such as batch coordination? Appropriateness. Does the technology fit into the people's daily lives? Is there sufficient level of local capacity to utilize and maintain the filter? Can it be adapted to local practices? Acceptability. I'm getting a lot of feedback in the background. Let me go on. Acceptability. What will people think of the technology? Is it biosand filtration considered trustworthy? Will use be demand driven by the users and key stakeholders? Cost. What are the costs of the school for the school community? Is the community able to afford to contribute to the building of the filter and commit resources to maintain it? Is there sufficient mechanism to mobilize the community? Implementation, what is required to get the technology into people's lives and routines? Can the filter be built with local technical capacity? Your partners and local contractors. And there's a few other practical considerations like, is there year-round sources of water available? Like the BSF, if it needs to be constant use. Also, source water should not contain chemical contamination beyond local health guidelines. Again, like the BSF, there are limitations. Finally, pipe water supplies are not anticipated. We want to avoid competition of options where the filter may be abandoned. We are hoping that the filter could last more than 10 years, so we wouldn't want it to be abandoned anytime soon. Let me pass on the next section to Ray.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. So I'm going to move into some of the details about this design features. And just to segue in from what Ron was just saying, we fully recognize that the technology we're describing today doesn't fit and work everywhere, and that there's limits to its appropriate application. So I've got 6 different slides. We'll go one at a time, and I'll highlight different design features that I think are important to you understanding how this system works, its benefits and its limitations, and really focus on how this system compares to a household biosand filter, which I imagine most of our listeners are familiar with. So in this diagram, I can move my cursor around here a little bit. On the left, you can see the sand levels that are involved. So typically, these sand filters have 75 centimeters of sand, and then 10 centimeters of coarse sand and 10 centimeters of gravel. The media that's used is the same as a household biosand filter. So if you're implementing a biosand filter program and you're sifting your sand and measuring it according to CAWST's protocol using their sieve test kit, then you're already set. We intentionally did not want to change the media so that we could leverage all that was known about the performance of this sand and make it easier. It is a little bit deeper. Typically, we try and reach 75 centimeters of sand, which is more than the 55 you typically have in a household biosand filter. I will point out just before we move on that there's the riser pipe that I mentioned before on the right here has an overflow weir, and that controls the standing water, just like a biosand filter, a household biosand filter. And then the difference between the water at rest and the top, where the top of the flow valve is what we call the driving head. And so here you can see 15 centimeters of driving head. The point of this slide is just to say that the sand is really the same as it is for household biosand filter, with a little bit different depths. So one of the key things that makes this system work and produce more water than it would otherwise produce if it were just intermittently operated alone is the float valve. So all of these systems have a float valve that are installed on the side of the tank, and that float valve allows water to come in from the reservoir that you saw on the left before into the tank, and it keeps the water at a fairly constant level. So under normal operation, as long as you've got water in your source water reservoir, your water will sit here 20 centimeters above the top of the sand and about 15 centimeters above the overflow weir. And that'll give you a constant flow rate. That's an advantage over the household biosand filter, where you have a declining rate of flow with peak flows and lower flows, and similar in some ways to the desert storm filter that some of you might have heard about. So all of this was just done to engineer a hydraulic loading rate of 0.12 to 0.2 meters per hour, which is is the same as cubic meters per square meter per hour. I wouldn't really worry about those units if you're not familiar with this. All this is to say is that the flow rate is 30 to 50% of that of a household biosand filter. So we're half or a third of the flow rate. And that flow rate was lowered to make sure that the quality of the water coming out of these filters was as good or better than a household biosand filter. The last thing to mention about the float valve is that it allows, and the reservoir tank, it allows a large volume of water to be filled in the tank and for that water to flow slowly over the day or over the night. So at the end of the day, you could fill your source water tank, the float valve would slowly release that into the filter, and you could run during a day or over the night. And we see production rates of 2,000 to 3,500 liters per day from the filter at a slower flow rate than the household biosand filter, or at least a slower hydraulic loading rate. Another thing that's different from the household biosand filter is the way that the underdrain operates. Just to make sure there was no clogging at the port, we installed a perforated pipe PVC underdrain under the gravel. Here's an example of two different types of underdrains, the octagon on the top right and the square on the left. And these have holes that are perforated in them about 5 centimeters apart with 3 millimeters in diameter holes. And those holes are actually arranged so they face down. In the bottom left, the diagram kind of looks like the holes are pointing up, but the holes are actually pointing down. And that way, if any sand does migrate into the gravel underdrain, then that sand would have to also migrate up into the hole to clog your underdrain. Talked a little bit already about the riser pipe here. I just wanted to mention that it's on the outside and it feeds directly into the storage tank. It's intended to prevent siphoning, although we've never really seen any siphoning. Also, we'll highlight here that the source water reservoir is typically around 1,000 liters, and the stored filtered water tank is around 1,500 liters. That means that if you fill up your 1,000 liter tank at the end of a school day, for example, it can run all day and fill up your 1,500 liter stored water tank. And then in the morning, you've got water available for your students or community. And then at that time in the morning, you fill up your 1,000 liter tank again, and it runs all day. You can repeat that again 2 to 3 times a day, getting a fair volume of water. Last thing I'll mention is that this system can be adapted for batch chlorination. Here's a photo of a unit in the Philippines, I believe, where there's 2 tanks for stored water. You can see them on the left there, and you can alternate between them. So fill one up, add a little bit of chlorine, and then start filling the other one, add chlorine when that's full, and alternate back and forth. So if you have a good slow sand filter and batch chlorination, you're going to have good water from a microbiological perspective. We have good experience with schools in Nicaragua and El Salvador practicing chlorination. Other places have been more resistant to adding chlorine to their water. Appendix C of the manual has lots of ideas and options for chlorination and leveraging all of CAWST's experience with that. How do you fill this filter, you might ask? Here's a picture on the left of a hand pump. It's a positive displacement PVC pump. So these are provided in Cambodia, and you can pump by hand. And then I wanted to put photos on the right of motorized pumps. Lots of schools and the health centers and things like that that install these use motorized pumps. We don't actually have any pictures of the pumps, so we have pictures of the systems and kids in front of them. The last thing I'll mention here is that tank shapes are different all over the world. So I've shown you some different examples of different tanks in different photos, and the manual includes some instructions on what to do if your tanks are not the same size as the examples. We may be able to help, or CAWST may be able to help if you find your tanks are very unique wherever you are. But all that to say is that you do have to make some modifications depending on the tank size and shape. And then I'll turn it over to Ron, who's going to talk a little bit about what we've learned in the last few years about the performance.
Sure, thanks, Ray. To date, only one independent performance study was conducted, and this was done in 2015 through Laval University. The results were presented through a poster during the 2015 UNC Water and Health Conference. as you can see, removal rate is higher than typically reported for household ESFs. As you can see, it was 97.8%. This is consistent with expectations of about log 2 removal for slow sand filtration. NTU is at a very acceptable 0.56. If you wanted, the poster could be downloaded through the UMC website. Next, I'll take Ray for the next section, operation, maintenance, and troubleshooting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so a little bit of how these things are run and maintained. And again, all of this information that we're sharing, except for that poster Ron just pointed to, is available in the manual you can download from the CAWST website. Generally, we recommend that you run these every day, and not that we have a lot of evidence for that, but we recommend a fresh supply of water and nutrients for your biologically active filter. These are plastic containers with lids, and so we don't find them drying out very readily. We actually find that they're left often over the weekend and even for 4 or 6 week school breaks, and the schools just fill them up with water and run again. We haven't got a lot of complaints about that. We haven't done a lot of extensive performance testing at the startup, and that would really, I'll try, thank you, I'll try talking into my microphone. Hopefully you can keep hearing me. So there's an opportunity there to better understand these filters at startup if they've been idle for a while. And I know that there has been some research of late in household biosand filters and starting those up. So one of the questions I saw pop up on my screen was, does the first tank act as sedimentation? It certainly does. If you have an unprotected source water, you may have turbidity and other debris that's in there. And so we do find that these first tanks can fill with debris. One of the things that we recommend is a bit of a, almost like a colander at the top, or a bucket with holes you can put in to keep any large debris out. Anything that might clog your float valve would be very undesirable. And you can put fish nets or different things in to act as a filter to catch large items. But in terms of sedimentation, yeah, if you've got a high turbidity water, you'll just need to clean out this reservoir tank periodically. And that's why this isolation valve I pointed to before is there. And it's not really clear here, but there can be a valve right here so that cleaning it is just a matter of opening the bottom with a large bore valve to get a nice hefty flow. And if you stick a stick in there, you can disrupt it. And these are not secured tanks either, so if they're drained, you can actually turn it on its side to clean it out as well. The next question that everyone who's been involved with household biosand filters will say is, how the heck do you clean this thing? It cleans in a very similar way to a household biosand filter. It's a clean in place operation where we aim to disrupt only the top 1 or 2 centimeters of sand. It's a little bit different in that the filter surface is a lot larger, but that was, we tried to control for that in sizing the tank. So typically these tanks are 1,000 liters, which makes them about 1 meter in diameter. And typically the openings at the top are 25 to 30 centimeters, which means you don't have to reach in terribly far. You're never reaching more than 20 or 30 centimeters to get to the end to clean. So typically someone will just stick their arm in. I'm waving my, most of you can't see me, nobody can see me, but I'm waving my arm around over my computer right now, cleaning the top of the sand and disrupting the sediment that may have accumulated there, and then opening the wash valve or the waste drain valve here on the left. And you may need to do that a couple of times to get rid of enough turbidity. We recommend disposing that waste with care. It can be laden with pathogens. So some installations have a soak away pit on the side. An appendix in the manual has details on the design of a decant tank that can be used for water recovery as well. Oh, and I wanted to mention, how do you know when you need to clean it? It's really the same as the household biosand filter. When the flow is getting low, you decide to clean it. And so I included this next slide, which is actually the same slide I showed before, to show you how you can measure the flow rate. This PVC pipe coming into the filtered water storage tank actually extends quite a ways in, so that you can unscrew this cap and reach your arm in and measure the flow rate. You can get a pretty good indication if you fill your source water tank at the end of the day. It should only take about 8 hours to filter, and if you come back the next morning 12 hours later and there's still water in there, and your stored water tank is not full, then you know your flow rate's not high enough. But if you wanted to check it for monitoring purposes, you can easily measure it there. The next thing I wanted to talk about was the splash plate. It has a similar purpose to a diffuser basin or a diffuser plate in a household biosand filter to absorb the impact of the water that goes into the filter. You can see some examples of different things we have here. There's really no standard design anywhere. People are using any kind of container they can find to absorb the impact. I personally like the one on the right here, the orange one. A couple things to mention: I would avoid metal ones. In some installations, we've found a galvanic relationship between the metallic splash plate and the metallic components of the float valve, so you don't want to end up accelerating corrosion there. I will say one thing, that if the plate is designed the way I hoped when we were designing it, as it is in the bottom right, you don't actually need holes. The splash plate absorbs the impact, diffuses the water, and then it can flow into the sand without, or above the sand without disrupting the sand. Everyone really wants to drill holes in it, so most of them end up with holes in them. You can tell if your splash plate is working because the sand underneath is flat and smooth and remains so during the filter run between cleaning events. Yeah, one of the questions, troubleshooting things that comes up is, what if my filter becomes slow? Maybe it's slow at installation, or it becomes slow and I just can't get it clean, or I can't get the flow rate back up. So some of the issues could be, especially if it's at installation, that the sand doesn't meet specifications. So CAWST has detailed specifications and tools to measure the sand, and if it meets the specification, it should work. These take about 23 or 25 bags of sand, rice bags of sand, whereas a household biosand filter usually uses 1. So it's always good to check that your media meets the specification before you put the sand in. I've seen 2 of these where all the media was pulled out, and it's quite a job. Another possibility is under drain failure. So you want to make sure that your PVC pipe and the layers of gravel are installed properly to reduce that risk. Some of the solutions we've seen in the field are to reduce the silt content at the top of the media. So, for example, if your filter flow rate is too low and you find actually the sand is just too small, there's a lot of silt, some people will clean it out with their arm, going really deep and trying to recover that. Not entirely sure how that affects performance, but that's what at least some have done to avoid reinstalling the media entirely. Another option is to add 5 centimeters of driving head. So you can go down to the bottom here and see this, where we've got the float valve to 20 centimeters above the top of the sand. You can actually bend those float bars to so that you get 25 centimeters above the sand, giving you 20 centimeters of driving head. You can't usually get much more than that, because then you start running into the top of the filter body, the filter tank body of the plastic. But you may be able to get the flow rate you want by doing that. And if none of that works, then you're removing all the sand, washing that sand out and reinstalling, which is quite a bit of work. So you want to make sure you're checking your quality control as you install. And I thought here, I don't have any good pictures for this, but on troubleshooting experiences, I wanted to touch on some opportunities to change attitudes that we've seen in schools and communities where these have been installed. First one is that we don't need to clean. And if you go to a community or a school where they aren't keeping other things clean and you put a sand filter in, they're probably not going to keep their sand filter clean. But as a rule, the storage tank needs to be cleaned, the area around the filter needs to be cleaned periodically. And so sometimes that's an attitude change. They don't like the taste of chlorine in some institutions and countries, really, I should say, and cultures, and we try and promote chlorination with the sand filter. And I saw the question pop up. The results that we showed before did not include any chlorination. It was just the removal of E. coli from the filtration itself. Another comment that I get sometimes is that children have enough water. You know, I'll ask how much water are you putting through the filter, and they'll say, oh, we only put 500 liters a day. And I'll say, well, you have 500 students. Maybe you need more water than that. Oh no, they don't. They've never had more water than that. They don't need more water. So a lot of times with this infrastructure investment, there's an opportunity to change attitudes about water access. And then there's always the idea someone else will do it, and so that can be an issue. All right, so I'll turn it back to Ron. I'm sure some of you are wondering about costs.
Sure, thanks, Ray. Let me first start off by saying costs will vary considerably. And secondly, we expect that every implementer will require several iterations of the filter before they become fairly satisfied with the design. So optimization for a particular implementer may focus on cost savings or perhaps in the improvement in the design, such as greater output, ease of use, accessibility, function, robustness, which of course will gravitate toward higher costs. I wanted to give a quick example. The tanks that you choose will directly influence the design of your platform. Perhaps you may choose to batch chlorinate using 2 tanks, 2 storage tanks. So of course you'll need a larger platform. This in turn will affect the roof structure and the recommended fencing. So costs will increase. Ray and I just broke down the types of local costs you should plan for, such as cement, sand, containers, PVC components, including the pipes, connectors, valves, taps, and other infrastructure components like bricks and support material. An example from the DRC is that tanks cost a lot there. And so we were able to recover food-grade containers from the beverage industry. Of course, we cleaned them out, but they worked well. You'll see to your right a very detailed table. We present this only as an example of our work in Cambodia, where all the required parts were itemized for budget purposes. And if this is helpful, we'll forward this exemplar to CAWST for you to upload. Again, costs will vary, but the manual itself has a running list of materials for every main component. You may, I think that's the helpful way to calculate your costs for your filter, should you choose to build one. Of course, we factor in labor costs, which will vary as well. Typically, we invest in building the capacity of a local contractor and really have them oversee the build of several filter units. In our experience, and we'll just give you the range, a single unit itself, as you can see there, can cost as much as $2,500 to $6,000 USD. Ray will now speak on community engagement.
Thank you, Ron. So this is our last major section of our presentation here. And we just wanted to touch on some of the softer sides and of this. There's been a lot of technical talk. And yeah, basically we've seen a number of different things happen by different implementers. Here's an example of a public engagement notice board that went up at a school and was presented at a commune meeting to give everyone in the community information about what's going on at the school. I've seen trucks driving around with loudspeakers announcing this is what's happening, this is what's happening. To get community or school engagement and participation, we typically recommend that the community or school be responsible for the construction of a roof and fence, or if they require a fence. And so you can see that takes on a whole bunch of different forms. And one of the benefits of this is that, at least in most of the schools that I've been working in, they end up raising the money, anywhere from $100 to $500 to build one of these structures, and that often involves engaging the community. There's a lot of training that goes along with these things, as you can imagine. Here's a photo on the left from DRC of a water user group that's trained on how to operate and maintain this, and I think that includes teachers and community leaders and such. School directors or principals are often very important and need to be trained and equipped. And we often recommend the promotion of student clubs, of hygiene practices, and using the filter and around the water. Another thing that we've found interesting in Cambodia is that there's often not funds for covering operational costs. So some of the schools have liked using what's called a money saving box, where basically every family contributes around 10 cents a month, and then they've got money to cover their operating costs. This wouldn't work everywhere, but it's been successful in some places. And hand washing and sanitation promotion. I mean, if anyone's thinking to bring this kind of technology into their school wash program, then probably you've already got a school wash program. But if not, you would want to make sure to consider how to encourage hand washing along with the additional water supplies. So you can see on the left, I think this is the Philippines, there's a hand washing trough there, and it's got some of that nudging artistry. Here's a hand washing promotion event, photos on the right. Another thing that's been really popular in Southeast Asia is ownership ceremonies, just getting everyone from the community and the school and different government officials to come and have signatures and thumbprint stamps and cutting of ribbons, and really helping to have the community or school have a sense of ownership over their new infrastructure. Last thing I wanted to mention, and this slide covers a lot of different things. In general, we have monitoring resources in the manual, monitoring for an organization that's implementing this type of filter, even monitoring resources that schools can use to track and monitor the performance of their filter themselves. One thing that we've found useful is these compartment bag tests. Some of you may have heard of them. The website is on the screen, Aquagenics. And basically, these are 100 millimeter bags each with 5 different pockets. You're seeing 2 of them in front of you. And you fill the bag with sample, incubate it for 24 to 48 hours. And then after that period, if there's a color change to green, you have E. coli present. And if there's no color change, it stays yellow. And so the number of pockets that change color correspond to a most probable number for E. coli. And I'm highlighting this here because we've seen a lot of success in you getting school directors or other folks in leadership positions to take more of a responsibility for the water quality monitoring. So in this situation, we would help the school director collect the sample and then give it to them and say, you know, take this home and incubate it overnight, and we'll come back tomorrow. And you can almost, I want to give this visualization of the school director coming and saying, look, there's E. coli in my raw water, but there's not in my filtered water, and really having ownership over that data, which is in contrast to the NGO worker coming back with an output from a lab that's in a language that may not be the school director's first language, and there's really not that ownership over the data and the water quality in their own system. So seeing is kind of believing, and we've had a lot of success with this. And I'll turn it to Ron.
Sure, thanks, Ray. So just to round our presentation, over the years, SP, as you know, has had several iterations of design. As well, we developed 2 versions of a manual that we primarily use for internal purposes. And until we came to the point that we are satisfied with our design, we decided to more or less keep it to ourselves. But in 2016, we then consulted CAWST to co-develop a manual that could be shared with others within their broader network. And in January 2017, the first version of the manual was released. And I'm hoping that all of you are familiar with this manual or can have access to this right away after our presentation. Like CAWST, we believe that filter is an affordable, appropriate technology that implementers should consider. As we briefly mentioned earlier, in a school setting, a broader school wash package should always be considered, the iSSF being a crucial component to the overall improvement of student health and well-being. And I did want to thank CAWST for the terrific work on the manual, Derek Baker and Naomi Mahaffey especially. We believe it offers a comprehensive guide for those considering the filter for themselves. So again, having rounded out our presentation, I think it's now time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Ron and Ray. That was a very good presentation, and thanks for presenting the manual as well. So with the recording, you will also receive a link to the manual if that's something you are interested in looking at. So now, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat box. We have a few already, so I'm going to start asking them. The first question, where is it? Okay, so the first question from Danielle. The first tank works as a sedimentation unit. So, so I think that was answered, but maybe you can precise your answer.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. We didn't intend it to act as a sedimentation unit, but it does act that way, and so maintenance needs to be performed because of the sedimentation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There was a comment from Martin who's got a project in India. He says, we have had several severe problems. The system will clog. This is using grey water. What is the limit of contamination allowed versus the surface of the filter? Did you get that? That's a lot of information in one question.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure. Generally, we recommend that folks use the best quality water available. Certainly, I think for the household water filter, CAWST recommends 50 NT or less. Is that correct? It's probably similar. Whatever the rules are for the household biosand filter, you probably have similar rules for this filter.
And in any case, I would say this filter, as well as the biosand filter, they are not designed for grey waters. They're
Good point.
Yes, meant for the best quality water you can possibly find to produce drinking water.
That's a very good point, because with 2 log bacteria removal, you wouldn't want to be drinking grey water.
Plus, I will just add, because that's a question I get a lot with both filters. When you're treating grey waters, you want to have a way to remove the fat and grease from soap, for example, first, which those filters won't allow that they are designed right now. So that's a completely different approach. Okay, so we have a question from James about the chlorine taste. Can you get the people to wait the smell taste decrease?
That's a big topic, I think. One of the problems with batch chlorination, I'll say, is that it's difficult to finely tune your dose. Yeah, I don't think it's a great question, but I think it's outside of the scope, really, to go into that. It would be great to explore ways to better chlorinate. I agree.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A question from Danielle: how long does the water remain potable?
That's a good question. If you're chlorinating, then I think the typical rule is 72 hours. And most of the systems we're installing are not even chlorinated. But I will say that on the poster that you can download from the UNC website, we looked at the difference between the filtered water quality and the stored water quality. There was some increase in E. coli, but we weren't able to correlate that to water storage time, interestingly. So it's an area that needs to be researched.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Question from James: who supplies the E. coli test bags?
Yeah, on the slide, there's a website called aquagenics.com, and those can be purchased directly from them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Question from Henry. Hi, Henry, by the way. I haven't communicated with you for a while. So Henry asks, is there any experience in the implementation of the filter in small towns besides the schools?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll defer that to Ron, but I will say that we've installed them in health centers as well. One of the things that works well with schools and health centers is that there's a concentrated group of people that will use quite a bit of water. Ron, do you know if this has been installed in communities or small towns?
Yes, just to mention there, in the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, there's shared usage. So the school and a local community share that, as well as in the Philippines. So the advantage there is that there's really no pause time whatsoever. So it's consistently used throughout the year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. A question from Ethan. Have you seen any attempt to upscale the size of the tanks or increase the flow rates?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can increase the flow rate by increasing the size of the tank for sure. You then need to figure out a way to clean the tanks if they get really wide. We didn't look at increasing the hydraulic loading rate or the flow rate per square meters of sand. We wanted to keep that low to get good quality. I will say that there's lots of opportunity to explore this, but also that you may also just look at having two filters in beside each other rather than one bigger filter. That would allow you to have one filter to waste or something like that for a recovery period after cleaning. So I wouldn't, if you wanted more flow than this, I wouldn't automatically go to a bigger tank. I would also consider using two filters in parallel.
Thank you. Just a comment from Candice, who's part of our team at CAWST. She says that the turbidity is a guideline of 50 NTU or less. The more just a guideline rather than a rule.
Candice is going to make me be careful with my words.
All right, a question from Pat. Can you talk a little about training technicians to construct the systems in Cambodia, or did you train and build capacity in local workers?
That's a great question. For those that are familiar with Cambodia, there's several organizations that have been implementing biosand filters for a long time, and so they had quite a bit of capacity to implement household biosand filters. So it was just a matter of converting that capacity to work in schools. And in many parts of Cambodia, because there's so many household biosand filters, and they're really liked a lot, it was easy to go into a school environment and say, hey, we've got something that's kind of like the household biosand filter, but it's for schools, and there was a very good response. So with the promotion, we already had a lot of staff capacity, and when I say we, I mean Samaritan's Purse and other implementers. And we actually hired contractors to build the concrete slabs, and found that local skilled labor was more efficient and effective at doing that than NGO staff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. A question from Bogdan. How about using zeolite instead or together with sand?
Sounds like a great research question. Just remember that each one of these needs 25 rice bags full of sand, and we've got hundreds of them, so we're talking about getting a lot of zeolite around to different places.
Mm-hmm. This is more a comment from Henry. He asked if you can share the spreadsheet of the costs. So that's something we can include in our follow-up email.
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll share the detailed list, which will only be for the unit in Cambodia. I'm not sure the costing there. Well, we can share rough costing as well. Yes.
So there is a question from Kathy, but I'm not sure I understand it myself. If the water is tested with the Aquagen system, I guess, and it shows...
Yeah, aquagenic system.
Okay, thank you. It shows E.coli. What is the treatment? And it is chlorine.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you will see in the manual, there's a flow chart, kind of like a decision flow chart that we made. that recommends what to do if you, under different scenarios, and one of them is what to do if you find E. coli. Yeah, chlorine is definitely recommended. I mean, if you find E. coli, you should chlorinate. In many of the situations, we would find E. coli in the storage tank, but not in the filtered water. So the schools would prefer to clean out their storage tank and then hope for the best moving forward and avoid chlorination at all costs. But we do recommend chlorination for sure, but it's very difficult to get that practiced.
Right. And our last question is from Mary, and she asks if those filters have been considered for Haiti. I don't know if you have any information about Haiti.
Let Ron answer that one.
Actually, we ourselves haven't considered these filters for Haiti, so that's what we're hoping this presentation does inspire some others to consider that for the needs there.
Yeah, I personally haven't heard of those systems in Haiti so far, but hopefully. Okay, there is one last question that just came up from Bogdan. What about arranging a recirculation between a reservoir, a storage tank during the rest period to keep the filter fed? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, that would be interesting. You would need to have some kind of motorized pump to get up the hydraulic grade line. It would keep it wet, and if you had the sample being aerated during that recirculation, you could introduce oxygen too. It sounds a little bit complicated for most installations.
Well,
but it could help.
Okay, I'm glad you understood the question. I understand it now. Perfect. So I guess that's it for today.
I see one more question here about viruses.
Oh, I didn't see it. Perfect. Go ahead.
We haven't done any virus removal study with this filter. That would be something very interesting to do. I will say that because the loading rate is roughly a half or a third of the household biosand filter, we'd expect removal to be equal or better. I know that Mark Elliott and others have found that the household biosand filter, the virus removal in the household biosand filter benefits from a pause period. I don't know how that would factor into all of this, but it's something definitely worth looking at is what kind of virus removal would you expect? And it would probably depend on the surrogate virus you used as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Ron and Ray, for a great presentation and for taking time for questions.
You're very welcome. It's been our pleasure.
And
yeah, thank you everyone for the great questions.
Thank you. And so we will be sending the recording very shortly, probably sometime this week. Thank you, everybody.